Freaking beautiful. Absolutely freaking beautiful. Overtime here at Old Favorite Friday, where we are continuing a conversation about an absolutely incredible beer, Duvel, that was selected by our good friend Kelley Meyer. If you don't know Kelley, he has a podcast called How Not to Start a Damn Brewery. He also has a book of the same name that you can check out. Kelley, we had you on the United We Drink podcast several weeks ago. And when we started talking about Old Favorite Friday, I asked you if you wanted to be on, and you didn't even bat an eyelash. I was like, because usually people are like, I don't know, there's many different beers. You said Duvel. It's got to be Duvel. So why is that?
I think for me, honestly, there was a few beers throughout the timeline that really took that concept of what fizzy yellow bullshit that I used to steal from my dad and turn it on its head. And Duel is one of those. Like it's one of those beers that's deceptively simple, and the more you drink it, it's so complex. And which I'm sure we'll talk about. The actual production of it is a humongous pain in the ass. But at the end of the day, you don't think about that when you're drinking it. So it would just for me, it was an eye-opening beer. Obviously, 8% alcohol when I was in my early 20s. Beautiful, loved it. But just think it's a fantastically made beer and very inspirational for me as a brewer.
It is. We do a beer every year, our Grand Cru, and it's never the same beer twice. It's always just water, yeast, hops. It's never adjuncts, basically, right? So we do that a different every year. Last year's version, I think, was it was last year's version was basically a love letter to Duvel. It was a Belgian Golden Strong Ale, and we were trying to make it not make a clone by any chance of such as imagination, but trying to make a similar beer. So I feel you there. You mentioned about the process, and we always like when people bring knowledge to the situation. I don't know anything about the process of making Duvel, so why don't you tell us?
Well, I'll tell you what I know, but I will say this: if you've ever listened to Brendan Kearney's podcast, the Belgian Smock,
Mm-hmm.
he used the brewer, and so I was always a fan of the beer. And then I think it was a year and a half, the year before I sold. So yeah, maybe 2 years ago. I was listening to this podcast episode, and the brewer just goes into detail about the timing of the decoction, the malt selection, the specific hops, and I'm sure that you know about the yeasts and how they came up with this. There's like 50 different yeast strains that were in a Scottish ale or whatever, and they just pulled out the one, hit it off to the side, and that's this unique dry beer that I'm. For me, one of the things I think is really cool is that it's a Belgian beer, but a lot of those Belgian aromas and flavors are just so integrated. A lot of the American versions I have are just banana heavy or phenol stricken to a fault, and this isn't. It's just balanced, and there's nowhere to hide it. So it's like this light pilsner malt where they're able to hide and balance this. I just think it's an amazing brewing achievement.
Well, simplicity is we every time we talk about a beer for Old Favorite Friday, unless it is a pumpkin beer or something a little more off the wall, we're typically talking about simple beers, extremely well made, and the fact that people don't appreciate them as much as they might be once did or as much as they should because of their simplicity, but they still get such complexity out of it. And you hit the nail on the head when you talk about this beer. I am stricken by the hop presence here. I'm always embarrassed when I talk about some of these beers because I will say this is one of my favorite beers, and then I look back and go, I don't think I've had one of these in 2 years. So I get it for a lot of people who don't drink these beers regularly, but the hops are present here, and I guess that kind of struck me as surprising.
Yeah, they actually did a couple of different dry hop versions of it, and I have to say, to be honest, I hated them.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they just weren't. And one of them was Citra. How do you mess it up with Citra in it? But for somehow it did not work for me with the flavor profile of what it was. But yeah, it has like enough hops. I think they do actually use aged hops in this, so there's like a blend to kind of give it, it's a little character and a little depth to it. But yeah, actually, so when I sold the brewery, which was I guess September 3rd, 2021 is when we closed. I did one last beer that summer. And so we were a mixed culture only brewery. And I'd made a mixed culture version of basically Duvel's, very similar recipe, long decoction mash. And I didn't even put a label on it. I dipped my thumb in paint, I stuck it on a bottle, and I just called it Peace Out Bitches. And it was my last beer that I ever made.
How'd it turn out?
So I actually intentionally didn't drink it then, and I have saved it. So I meant to open one on the 1 year anniversary. September was a bit of a crazy month, so I just when we were doing this, I was like, you know what? I have like those 10 bottles. I need to open one. So sometime this week, I'm going to open one. And now that it's aged for a year and a half, it's probably right where I want it to be. So I'm really curious.
I mean, I'm curious. I want to know. I mean, I might not be able to taste it, but I want you to describe it to me. That sounds like a pretty cool project.
I'll definitely let you know. I'll send you something for sure.
So another thing about this that you mentioned that I thought that I feel like we do repeat ourselves a little bit here, but I think it's so important to understand the beers that you're talking about that all are banana and phenols and kind of one dimensional. There's a lot of American versions of Belgian style beers, and to the beer with classic Belgian styles, when you drink them, they are dry. You know, even quads, when they're made by great breweries, which is a style that should be a little bit sweeter, are not as sweet as the Americanized version of those. And this beer just drives that point home. It is bone dry and drinkable, where I feel like if most breweries in the US making a clone of this, it would taste like, you know, banana cream pie.
Yeah, well, for my palate, even I like delirium tremens, but delirium is way more banana. It's way more that
Yes.
of all the phenols. Which again, I don't think is bad, but for me, I I think that's easier to make, I guess is my point. So to be able to balance that out, and my personal opinion is one of the ingredients that American brewers don't use as often as they should is patience. And so I'm sure that has a lot to
100%, man. I mean, I worked at a brewery long ago where, you know, all of our tank times were like 14 to 16 days. And some of them were down to like 12 days. It's like, oh, we got to get this beer in and out in 12 days. And for our friends that are not in the brewing community, do not brew for a living, that's a very, very fast turnaround time. You get stressed yeast, you get bad fermentations, you get low attenuation. There's a lot of problems that arise from that. And beers like this, they take time. You need to pitch the right amount of yeast at the right temperature. And you have to realize that not just the fermentation is important, but the maturation of that beer being able to sit and really develop the flavors properly.
And it's hard because obviously it is a business. And so you've got timelines you have to meet for distributors and release parties and Instagram posts. But at the end of the day, you got to have that sort of like understanding of the patience piece of it. And I think I've actually heard brewers brag to me about doing lagers in 14 days. Like that's an achievement that they think is great. High temperature diacetyl rest and all the games you can play. I'm just like, did you make it better or did you make it faster? And the answer is always that we made it faster. It's not better. And I still appreciate the old world styles better. So why are you doing it? At some point, I don't know. That bugs the crap out of me, but so
There's a lot of bugaboos we have about the industry. I think a lot of them probably come out in your podcast, talking about how not to start a damn brewery and conversations about that. Can you tell us just a little bit about the podcast?
Yeah, well, it started in the beginning, as was the book. It was as much me getting a lot of anger and frustration out when I was facing the extinction of the brewery. And so what I really wanted to do, so what happened for me is I was looking for this podcast. I'm online looking for a business of beer podcast and, how to run a brewery, what goes wrong. And I obviously couldn't find it. And so like all ideas, I decided I need to make it. So I started interviewing people about what they experienced, what was the beer good, but the marketing was wrong, and just kind of getting a feel for that. And I've just been loving it. So I'm 35 episodes in at this point. I'm interviewing a cider on Tuesday. I interviewed a meadery last week. Just really kind of stretching out. I did my first Canadian brewery, so I'm now international. So
Nice. Well, if you want to check out the podcast, I highly, highly recommend it. And I highly recommend that you go to the episode with Kevin Abbott, who is a guy I've heard is from Barrel Amongst Brewing. I think it was a good episode. I had a blast. And if you also want to hear more with Kelley, you can go to United We Drink in our podcast feed, podcast that I am one of the hosts of. And we interviewed Kelley recently, too. If you want to find out some more content, you can also check out his book. You can buy it. I've got it right now in front of me up on Amazon, How Not to Start a Damn Brewery. Not the podcast, but the book. So if you want to check that out, it's a pretty good read. Kelley, thank you so much for joining us, picking out a really, really great beer. Can't say enough good stuff about a classic, dry, drinkable Belgian style coming from a Belgian brewery guy. You have anything else you want to touch on?
I appreciate you having me on, man. That any opportunity I can take to drink a Duvel, I appreciate. And like you, I haven't had it as often as I should. So thank you very much.
All right, guys. Cheers. We'll see you next week.
Cheers.